Okay, we'll go ahead and get started with our new module. So this module is on radical and ionic reaction mechanisms. So we're going to look at substitution reactions. So the word means exactly that, substitution. We're taking some group and substituting it for another. The context in which I'll lay out this module is we're starting from alkanes, so CC and CH bonds, and then we're gradually going to move on to substituting hydrogens and alkanes for all the other functional groups that we know. So this is two main mechanisms. The first one, which we'll start today, is done with a radical mechanism. That's a single electron. And then as we move forward, we'll do substitutions with ionic mechanisms, and that means the movement of two electrons. And then we'll finish off the semester with eliminations, which is the other main type of reaction for organic 1. So at this point, we're going to start focusing more on reactions, the mechanisms by which they happen, and we'll start looking at a little bit of kinetics and thermodynamics. And those things will help us understand how do we know exactly where a reaction is going to take place in a molecule. So at this point, we need to start considering all the stuff that's presented to us above a reaction arrow, all the conditions. And what are those things telling us about the starting materials and then what functional groups are produced? So we're going to start with alkanes because they're isolated from petroleum, and we're going to sort of add value to the carbon backbone as we learn these mechanisms. And so once we get functional groups on the backbone, then we can start considering how do we use that functional group to do the next reaction and then develop these sequences. So as I said, we are looking at substitution. And so the first part of this is given an alkane. You know how to look at it and figure out the unique sets of hydrogen. So basically, a hydrogen in any of those sets can be substituted for a halogen. And there's a specific reason why we want to approach it that way, to functionalize the carbon backbone. So let's look at the big picture here, and we'll consider starting with methane. So methane is CH4. There's one set of hydrogen that integrates to 4. And so all 4 of those hydrogens are the same. Under a reaction called chlorination, we can substitute an H for chlorine. So this hydrogen that I've highlighted in red, it gets substituted. So we've made a new compound, chloromethane. So let's put in some lone pairs here on the chlorine. And let's consider what the effect of that chlorine is now on the carbon atom. So from electronegativity, we can say the chlorine's delta minus, and now the carbon's delta plus. Through doing that substitution, we've introduced a polar covalent bond, the CCl bond, and we've made that carbon delta positive, which will further allow us to substitute that chlorine for something else. So we're going to introduce some new nomenclature here. The chlorine can be classified as a leaving group. So we can react that molecule that has a leaving group now with a nucleophile. And on the slide here, the nucleophile that I've chosen is going to be hydroxide. So the chlorine gets substituted for OH, and now we've made an alcohol. So as you look at the physical properties of each of these, we started with something that was nonpolar. We've now made a polar molecule, and we've used that as a leaving group to substitute for this nucleophile. To make a different molecule, and so then it has different chemical and physical properties. So a nucleophile is a Lewis base. In a reaction mechanism, it supplies the electrons. So nucleophiles react with this thing that has the leaving group. That term overall would be electrophile. So as we saw in the prior module, an acid-base reaction is the transfer of a proton from one chemical to another. More generally speaking, we use the terms nucleophile and electrophile for everything else that's not an acid-base reaction. So you can see as we substitute from H to Cl, Cl to OH, that affects the melting points, the boiling points, the chemical shifts, all that sort of thing. And the reason that I want to present the logic to you from alkane to haloalkane to substituted product is that you can't skip over this middle thing. Like, you can't take an alkane and make an alcohol. You have to do a substitution of H for some halogen first, because now you've differentiated the carbon atom so that it's positive, and then you can substitute it with something, some other nucleophile. The nucleophiles that we'll learn are basically all the other functional groups we've talked about in terms of IR and NMR. So think about how an alcohol looks in the IR, how a nitrile or cyano group looks, an ester, that sort of thing. So in the simplest case with methane, it's just H to halogen. But now imagine you have a carbon backbone with many unique sets. How do we know exactly where on that carbon backbone an H is going to get substituted? So to understand that, we have to look at the classes. Are they methyl, methylene, or methine? And then consider the halogen that's involved. So no matter how many sets there are, we can differentiate them using thermochemistry. And that's the energy required to make or break bonds. So that those are just literature values. We'll show a table of that. So the first part of this mechanism here is a radical. And that's the movement of a single electron. The second type of reaction was ionic. And that's the movement of two electrons. So on this slide, I have no reaction, and I want to sort of further specify that. I'll say no ionic reaction. If you take methane and mix it with sodium chloride, you will never do that sort of substitution. Methane or sodium hydroxide will not form methanol either. Because if we're looking at it from a purely ionic point of view with two electrons moving, what happens is that this H it would have to leave as H minus. So that's hydride. And so the reason that can't happen is if we look at the conjugate acid of that, which is H2, it has a pK of 35. So when we start talking about leaving groups, one of the reasons we talked about acidity for quite a while was it translates into this ionic mechanism of how do we know what is a good leaving group. So hydrogen's not a good leaving group. Halogens are because their conjugate acids have a sufficiently low pKa that makes that halide minus a very stable ion when it leaves. So to tie in these two mechanisms together from radical to ionic, we're going to have to put everything we've learned so far together to explain the difference between the radical functionalization and then the ionic substitution mechanisms. This last part, once we get a halogen in the molecule, that should become a little bit more apparent about leaving groups and pKa values. So on this slide, I have the chemical and physical properties of halomethanes. But I want to make clear, even though it's just the one carbon unit, you need to kind of imagine any sort of carbon backbone. What is the effect of that halogen on the carbon it's bonded to and then the entire backbone? So from methane, which is nonpolar, to the halomethanes, you can see that introducing the halogen changes the physical properties quite a bit. The carbon signal shifts based on electronegativity trends, and then you see that for the proton sets as well. So once we have the X atom in there, that allows us to do many more things. As I said, we'll learn how to substitute it. Then in Module 5, we'll eliminate it, and that will allow us to access alkenes, and then that gets into the chemistry of alkenes. So in a sense, from the alkane functional group, using this strategy, we can, in theory, make any molecule known. But what you have to do is use your imagination, because there's only so many examples that we can cover in class here. So let's do a thought experiment here. And this is based on the unique sets for these hydrocarbons: methane, ethane, and propane. We want to guess how many monochlorinated derivatives exist for each. So for each of those, you're going to figure out the unique sets of hydrogens. Then you're going to take one hydrogen from each set and substitute it for chlorine. And that gives you the possible isomers that you can produce from a reaction. So we just saw that methane has one set. That means you can only form one monochlorinated methane. So ethane, the two methyl groups are equivalent, so there's just one set. So we substitute an H for Cl, we get chloroethane. And then for propane, how many monochlorinated constitutional isomers can you produce? So you can produce 2. So we have the methyl groups are equivalent, that's one set. We could substitute an H for Cl in there. And then we have the methylene group, the CH2, that's another set. So overall, we would get 2. And so just to refresh our memory, when we classify the hydrogens in propane, these are primary. And then the methylenes were secondary. So that's going to be important for us when we start trying to rationalize, okay, of all the possible products, which one is going to be the major one? Being able to do that, then looking at these tables will help us determine, okay, it has to react here based on these bond dissociation energies. It's going to be the major product. So overall, we would get, I think, C here, 1 for methane, 1 for ethane, and 2 for propane. And all we're doing is looking at the unique sets. We substitute an H for a halogen. So in the two unique sets of hydrogen, they're in a ratio of 6:2 for a total of 8. If you had to convert that ratio 6:2 to percent, what do you think that would be? What? So D, 75-25? So you're taking the individual class divided by the total, that just converts the ratio into percent. So now in considering propane and then the two monochlorinated constitutional isomers possible, if you ran the reaction, what percent yield of each do you think would form? So it's going to be D again, because you're just using the statistics of those hydrogens. So we really, at this point, we're just trying to build out a possible scenario to help understand what the product distribution in theory could be. And then our hypothesis is when we run the reaction, do we see those products in those percent yields? So one of the reasons why I introduced the spectroscopy part early on was that for any particular reaction, there's the product that you want to form, but then there's all of the isomers that can form. And so how do you differentiate what you're seeing in terms of the major versus minor? So because there were 6 primary hydrogens, we would expect to see that the 1-chloropropane be present in a 75% yield. There were 2 of the secondary, so we would think 2-chloropropane would be there in 25% yield. And that's just based on the statistics of substituting. So which answer, A or B, assigns the proton data appropriately? So you're given a lot of information here. Some of it is kind of irrelevant in terms of just answering the fundamental question being asked. How many unique sets of H does this have? This has 3, and then this one has 2. So 3 and 2. And so really what you're looking for is 3 signals. So for A, you have 1, 2, and 3. And then 1 and 2. So that's the connection that you're making. You don't really have to go into any of this stuff at that point because the responses kind of funnel you into that just based on the number of unique sets. So you could use the proton NMR just to see what the data is telling you in terms of major versus minor. As we start learning these reactions, what you want to keep in the forefront is you're given a starting material, and then you're given some set of conditions, the reaction conditions. So what functional groups are present in the starting material? You want to classify carbons, hydrogens, and then as we move forward, what are the other functional groups? Then you need to look at what are the reaction conditions, the reagents. Are they acidic? Are they basic? We'll learn things called oxidants, reductants, all these different classes. So you have to match the reaction conditions to what functional groups are present. Then as a first pass over, you can kind of memorize this functional group plus that reagent gives this specific other functional group. But you're going to encounter scenarios where you don't know what that reagent is doing. So you have to look at its structure and make some approximations or guesses. So you'll find we're slowly moving towards the deeper water here, but you can always rely on the fundamentals to explain your way through a reaction or a mechanism. So in radical reactions, it's the movement of a single electron. And we're going to look at the chlorination of methane a little bit more in depth, but keep in mind you need to expand this mentally out to any other hydrocarbon, no matter the carbon count, the classes of hydrogen, etc. So we have our alkane. In this case, we're going to use chlorine Cl2. We're making a halo alkane. And then we have this byproduct, hydrogen chloride. So we're going to go through it with chlorine, but we'll summarize it for every other halogen. So F2, Br2, and I2. So just by looking at that, you can kind of memorize, okay, like a hydrogen's being substituted for chlorine. It's not that difficult because there was only one set of H. But since we're going to be dealing with higher carbon counts, we have to look at the mechanism a little bit more closely using bond dissociation energies. And the way that I'm going to present this, so this delta H with the little degree sign is the change in enthalpy. It's bonds broken plus bonds formed. So on the reactant side, you have to break bonds. That means you have to put energy into the system. So this number is going to be positive right here. On the product side, you're forming bonds. That means energy is released. So the number that you get from the table, you're going to put a minus in front of it. And then you're just adding those two together. I personally don't like to put the subtraction sign in here because it can get confusing. As long as I remember these relationships, it's a little bit easier to understand chemically. If you remember from Gen Chem, electrochemistry, that was always the bane of my existence. There was these things called like half cells. You had an overall transformation and you had to look at each thing. So on your reactant side, you have two different bonds that are breaking. A C and an H, a Cl and a Cl. So you have to look up their individual values. Then on the product side, you have bonds that are making, C and Cl, H and Cl. So on each side, you're adding two numbers. Then on the product side, you're just sticking a negative in front of it because it's evolving heat. Based on the radical reaction, the type of bond it's called a bond dissociation energy, and it's homolytic. That means same cleavage. So in methane, we have C and H, and we're just generalizing that to this thing here, A and B. That's the bond we're interested in making or breaking. So if we see the bond, we need to split it homolytically. That means A and B are each getting an electron. So we represent that with that fishhook arrow. That means the movement of one electron. So this is how you want to think about it on the reactant side. You have to break that bond. On the product side, you're just flipping it around. You have to make the bond. So the electrons come together to make that bond. And the reason that you want to know the different classifications of the carbons and hydrogens is because there's a table that you have to go to and find that specific scenario. And you can approximate somewhat, but you don't want to be too far off because then that might give you overall the wrong answer. So these things here with that dot, that's the single electron, those are called radicals. And a radical is a reactive intermediate. That means it's higher energy than where you started. And we're going to look at a way of visualizing energy as the reaction time progresses. So we'll plot energy versus time, and that's called a coordinate. So anytime I use the term reactive intermediate, it's going to be higher in energy than the starting materials. Because you have these things that are not in their neutral valencies, they're not happy, they want to form bonds to form neutral things. Any questions so far? So that's the transformation. We're going to look at how the bonds split, how the electrons move, and how do we account for the bond association energies. So here is methane splitting. That blue arrow is showing you the movement of a single electron. Notice kind of the fishhook thing. Then we get a methyl radical and hydrogen. One key thing to note as well, we're starting with an sp3 hybridized carbon. And the radical is sp2. So we have that p orbital, and the single electron density is in the p orbital. I represent it as the dot, like the particle of an electron is a dot, but you have to keep in mind that single electron density is in the top and the bottom lobe of that p orbital. And so why is that important? So far we've looked at methane, ethane, propane, but when we get into butane, butane now has secondary or methylene H's. And if you form a radical at one of those, now you have a top and a bottom face of that p orbital. So when the chlorine gets substituted, you have the possibility of generating stereoisomers, R and S. So you can substitute from the top or the bottom. That will happen equally. So any stereocenter you generate will be a racemic mixture. So for the radical conditions, this homolytic cleavage is typically supplied with light or heat. So you have to supply enough energy to break that bond to get the reaction going. And so this is just reproduced from your book. These change in enthalpy values. Basically for this half reaction. So I don't know if that's the correct term or not, but that's what I like to use. Where you have to go to this specific class, find out, what type of carbon, what type of hydrogen, then look up the value required to cleave that bond. So notice these values are all positive because they're not showing a negative sign, but if you need to use this number on the product side, you just stick a negative in front of it. So here's hydrogen, deuterium, there's their values. These are the values for cleaving the X2 of halogens. hydrogen halides, we'll use those. And then for methane, there's your single carbon and then the group it's attached to. And the line is the bond that you're breaking. So the same thing for ethane. Now the difference with propane is because you had primary and secondary. So this is where you need to make sure you're finding the right value because they're a little bit different. Notice not every molecule that you've studied or is known is on here. So when you have a molecule that's new and it doesn't sort of match anything, you have to find the best fit. So you need to find, okay, a secondary hydrogen or a tertiary one, because it's probably not going to be on there exactly. So the last column here are some special cases we'll talk about. These are now carbon-carbon, OH, and OO. So all of these will play a role in the reactions that we learn moving forward. So that's the resource that you're going to go to help understand the thermochemistry of the two half reactions on the reactant side and the two half reactions on the product side. So we're looking for 4 numbers. We add them, and then we stick a minus sign, then we add that, and we get an overall number for the reaction. So this is the overall transformation right here. Methane plus chlorine gives chloromethane plus HCl. So in methane, we have to break a CH bond. So there's the methane. We could push the arrows like that to generate the methyl radical and then H. We go to the table and we find that the value is 440 kilojoules per mole. So that has to be positive because we have to put energy in to break that bond. We do the same for chlorine, Cl2. That gives us 2 chlorine radicals. That takes 243, and then we add that number together. So we get, on the reactant side, plus 683. So on the product side, we made a C-Cl bond. So notice the half reaction is now reversed. We have the methyl radical plus the chlorine radical. They combine to make the CCl bond. And then we find the 352 from the table and we put a negative in front of it because that is releasing energy. Then H and Cl gives HCl, that was negative 432. We add those numbers together for the product side to get negative 784. So the reactant side plus the product side overall is negative 101 kilojoules per mole. So from where we started to where we ended up means that amount of energy was released. Since the sign is negative, we say that's exothermic. And the way that I try to remember this, if you're running the reaction, so we run reactions in glass flasks, if you put your hand on the flask, the flask would feel warm. So if that number is negative, that means heat is being evolved. There's heat coming out, so the system is warming up. So that's exothermic. If the number was positive, that would be endothermic. Your hand would feel cold because the reaction is taking in heat. And so from your hand, heat is transferring into the flask. So whatever the reaction is, you should be able to determine these half reactions, find these values, and then overall determine the sum. And then based on what falls out of that in terms of plus or minus, you assign endo versus exothermic.
How complicated of a molecule might we start with, like, what can you say?
So I mean, if you look at, from say carbon count 4 to like 6, whether it's acyclic or a ring, then you assign the uniqueness to that. From the total number of unique sets, the possibilities are kind of equal. It can be more if there's a stereo center. But what you have to do is, whatever based on the starting material, find the best estimate from the table to one of these values.
And if the carbon count was 6 and I would multiply that number maybe? Or no?
No, you're not doing that. You're just looking at it. So to kind of draw this out. So there's hexane. And so if you figured what are all of the possible monochlorinated hexanes you could produce, you're basically taking one H from each of these and then just substituting it for chlorine. To find the values in the table, you say, well, that CH looks kind of like propane. That looks like a secondary of propane. And then this is where you have to estimate it. That's also going to look like a secondary H of propane because the table is only so big. So to more refine that answer as we move towards the end of this lecture and then Wednesday, let me just write these in real quick. These are the classes. So primary, secondary, and secondary. The class of hydrogen will matter, and what halogen you use will matter, because these numbers will change around after you stick them in these tables, like what the outcome is. So this is a cheap plot drawn in PowerPoint showing a reaction coordinate. And all it is qualitatively a way to visualize how the energy is changing. So on the y-axis, you have that change in enthalpy, and we're using kilojoules per mole as the unit. On the x-axis, which is called the reaction coordinate, really it's time, as time evolves. So kind of at 0 time before all the reagents have been added, you have your starting materials. They're at some energy. The reaction goes on, things convert, it's complete, then you get your products. They're at some other energy. One of the main things to look for is the height of the products versus the starting materials. And really, you're just kind of drawing a line. Do the products lie above or below that line? And that helps understand the plus or minus sign from the calculation. So those are two main points on this coordinate. The starting material is the products. But then there's this other thing here. And if you think of this as like a hill, like that's the top of the hill. So from where you start to the top, energy has to be put in there. Energy has to be expended to get there. And these things are typically where your reactive intermediates will occur. So remember, a reactive intermediate is always higher energy than a starting material. And then overall, the products may be lower or they could be higher, depending on how that calculation of those half reactions falls out. So here is our horizontal line. Since the products lie below or are lower energy than where we started, that means the reaction's evolving heat, so it's exothermic. Notice this hump here. For the starting materials to get over that hump, that's endothermic because it's increasing if we go over to the y-axis. It's higher energy. That hump is called the energy of activation. So kinetically, it's a rate determining step. You have to get over that before things are converted into products. So by show of hands, how many of you have taken calculus? Okay, so you should know what I'm about to say, hopefully, if I can explain it well. I said that the x-axis is time, and time can, we think of decades, years, months, days, hours, seconds. There's these units, right? But like with your phone, you can always keep zooming in. So if I mark off, say 2 points in time, like with calculus, you can keep taking finer divisions in there, right? And that gives you a more accurate response. So if you keep collapsing these two things, these 2 points, to the top of this hill. The top of that hill is a very small amount of time passing. And that has a special term, it's called a transition state. So as that distance on the x-axis gets smaller and smaller, it's basically condensing to that point, which is the transition state, and that is the highest energy in the reaction coordinate. So your neutral starting materials have to be forming something very reactive that exists only for a short amount of time. It has a lot of energy. It wants to do something to go down to the products. So this is probably the most simple reaction coordinate. They can get more complex. So the top is a transition state. There can be more than one transition state in a reaction. And then we're going to learn about another type of reactive intermediate that is longer lived. So on this x-axis, it can hang around for a little bit. And that means instead of being on top of a hill, it's in a little trough or well. So these things can get more complicated than this, and you have to understand where along that coordinate either a transition state or a longer-lived intermediate is residing. I think the take-home message for this slide is from your starting material, that horizontal line helps orient you in terms of the overall, is it endothermic or exothermic, and where the transition state is going to lie. Any questions?
Are those longer-lived intermediate states still radicals?
So, I mean, for now, we're learning radicals, but in terms of reactive intermediates, you're going to learn carbocations, carbanions, and carbenes. So for sophomore organic, there's really 4 that we need to know. Yeah.
So you said the transition state could be, it's not always at the top, so it's basically just from where it changes from negative to positive.
The
To negative.
The transition state will always be at the top.
Always. Okay, I thought you said it could be in the trough.
Those are called intermediates.
Intermediate.
Yeah.
And you said there could be more than one transition state. So that means we will be adding and taking away energy throughout the process of the reaction.
So, I mean, they can be pretty complex based on how the electrons are moving. So really the mechanistic pathway is you're tracking the trajectory of those electrons and how they make and break bonds. So in something like, well, just erased it, but let me redraw something here. You know, you have your starting material, your products. Any point that's at the top is a transition state. The one that's the highest is the rate limiting step. These little troughs in between transition states, those are where the longer lived intermediates reside. So we want to further refine now, because we're going to talk, you know, above sort of methane, ethane, and propane. How do we rationally know where a CH substitution is going to occur if you have, like, you know, 4 or 5 different sets of H? You know, in your mind, you can write down all the possible products, but how do you predict which one is the major one? And you'll be able to do that based on classifying the type of hydrogen. So here are alkanes, the types of CH bonds, and then the half reactions of how they're broken, and then the values of breaking them from the table. So let's look at the propane. You have sp3 hybridized carbon H bonds for both the primary and the secondary. But what you notice, it takes a little bit more energy to break the primary. And so that little bit of difference will ultimately change how that those half reactions fall out in terms of your sum for the reaction total. So this last one says 2-methyl propane. So let me draw that. So that's 2-methyl propane. That's the one that has a tertiary hydrogen. So now we have the complete set where we have primary, secondary, tertiary. When you compare those values, you can see that the tertiary takes plus 400. And on this chart here, what I've plotted is increasing radical stability versus energy. If you're comparing these numbers, like think of yourself as starting at 0 and you're like climbing a ladder. So what's the lowest number you get to first? So from 0, you hit 400. Of all of these scenarios here, that means that is the easiest bond to break. And that's a tertiary CH bond. When you compare the reactive intermediates, that is saying a tertiary radical is the most stable compared to the secondaries and primaries.
Okay, so why would it be considered more stable if it's the easiest to break?
So say 400 versus 423. So once you reach 400, then to get to 423, that means you're putting more energy into it, which means it's more reactive. So it's kind of thinking one way versus the other. So reactivity versus stability. So once you have your alkane, you classify the unique sets, primary, secondary, tertiary. Now you have a little bit of guidance about where a substitution is going to occur. So I want to talk about two special cases here. So 400 for your Joe Schmo tertiary CH. That's kind of your value you want to keep in mind. There are weaker bonds that will cleave first. And they are allylic and benzylic bonds. Allylic means an sp3 hybridized carbon that is attached to an alkene. Benzylic is an sp3 hybridized carbon that's attached to a benzene ring. So you'll notice for each of these, so you have methyl and methyl, so they're primary. And on the prior table, the primary CH bonds were more difficult to cleave versus secondary and tertiary. Notice these values are both lower than 400. The reason for that is once you cleave the CH bond, you've generated the radical. That radical can be stabilized by resonance. So we can show that radical being delocalized onto the third atom of that system. In terms of the orbitals, you have your p orbital with the single electron. Then you have your double bond here. All you're doing is shifting the location of the double bond and the unpaired electron. Because that is stabilized, you don't have to climb that ladder as high to cleave the original CH bond. So these are the these are the ones that are tough and under, the constraints of what we are learning. These are the bonds that you will not break. So if you have these type of CH bonds in the molecule, they're not going to undergo this type of substitution. So if you look, they're well above, the 425 for the normal sp3 hybridized carbon H bond. And these are ones where the hybridization of the carbon is either sp or sp2. So the sp in ethine, that's the alkyne, that's really high, 547. That means even if you do have that type of CH in the molecule, you're starting from 0. You'll never get there because you're always going to encounter those ones that are like 400, 425 first. You can't hop over them to substitute there without going through your average sort of alkane hydrogen beforehand. So for sp2, these are either from benzene or an alkene. So make sure that you understand the difference between those and what was on the prior slide, allylic and benzylic. Any questions? So here's 4 compounds. Which one of these has the CH bond that will break the easiest through homolytic cleavage? What'd you say? So C, what type of hydrogen does it have? Is a tertiary hydrogen. So let's just draw the structures out first. So there are the structures. Then let's just classify the unique sets. So butane has 2 unique sets. We have a primary and a secondary. Cyclobutane has 1 unique set. They're secondary. The 2-methylbutane has 4 unique sets. So you have these primary. This is a different type of primary, secondary, and then a tertiary. The 2,2-dimethylbutane, all of these are 1 unique set. They're all primary. You have another primary and then secondary. So based on the table, we know that a tertiary CH bond is going to be the easiest to break. So if we take that just a little bit further, so there are the unique sets, color-coded, they're classified. You could take one hydrogen from each of those sets, draw all the possible constitutional isomers. But now that we know there's a difference in the bond association energies, even though there's 4 sets, we know that the tertiary ones are the most reactive. So regardless of the statistics or ratio, substitution is most likely going to occur there. And so that part of the understanding allows us to rationally, modify a carbon backbone without saying, yeah, there were 4 possible products. I don't know which one's going to form. Now we can have some more information that the major one is going to substitute at the 2 position. So here is a summary of what we've done so far, taking the carbon counts from 1 through 4, the different alkanes, the uniqueness pattern, classifying methyl, methylene, methine, and then showing what the substitution products will be. So what I want to point out is for butane, see that number's 2. So you could draw 1 chlorobutane or 2 chlorobutane. That's 2 possible mono-substituted products, but the total now is 3. So why is it 3? When you substitute at that secondary position, that's generating a stereocenter. So you're going to get both R and S enantiomers. And again, that's due to the radical as a reactive intermediate, the single electron and the p orbital having a top and a bottom face. So I think in general, once you figure out this number, that's giving you some guidance about, what these products could be. And then the next question is, are there more? They can really only arise from secondary or tertiary hydrogens. So anything that's a primary, when you substitute it, will not generate a stereocenter. So in the last couple minutes here, what I'll draw is how do the arrows flow? So we saw the half reactions. What does it look like when you start applying heat? What are the steps for this process? So we're going to start with chlorine. That was the weakest bond. So that's going to generate 2 chlorine radicals. The chlorine radical is then going to abstract a hydrogen. So now we have one of the products, HCl, then a reactive intermediate, methyl radical. The methyl radical will react with chlorine. So we're going to form a CCl bond. So that generates the chloromethane and then chlorine radical. So notice on the title of this slide, I've used the term radical quite a bit, but it also has this in here, chain. So this is a chain reaction. That chlorine radical that's produced there goes back up here and recycles that chain. So once the reaction kicks off through this chlorine homolysis to do that, the chlorine radical reacts with the alkane. You're now in these 2 steps, assuming that the thermochemistry works out. So chain reactions of this type have these different steps have names. This one's called initiation. These next 2 are called propagation. So you can say propagation 1 and 2. So in theory, that propagation steps 1 and 2 would continue on until all the methane was converted. But there are other things that happen called termination. And that's the combination of 2 radicals. So you can take your pick of any 2 that you want to combine. Say, for example, you have 2 methyl radicals. They find each other and react. You've now made ethane. That's terminated the chain because there's no longer a propagating radical. And it's further complicated things because there's now a second hydrocarbon in here that can get substituted. So on Wednesday, we'll look at the thermochemistry of the different halogens and see how the values change according to the different classes of hydrogen.